Your cat lies inside your house with the confidence of someone named on the property deed. It sleeps on your furniture, occupies your bed, and contributes absolutely nothing toward the rent. You buy its food, clean its toilet, and occasionally receive permission to touch its head. It may stare at a full bowl as though you have presented it with a personal insult. Yet let something tiny move across the floor, and the comedy suddenly ends. The eyes widen, the ears turn forward, and the body sinks toward the ground. The pampered little roommate disappears, and an ancient hunter takes its place. Your cat has never hunted beneath an African moon, yet its body remembers every step. Its ancestors still stalk there today, with the same stripes, long legs, and watchful eyes. Unlike dogs, cats would enter domestication without needing to rebuild the body that already served them perfectly. So how did that solitary hunter become the self-appointed ruler of your home? The answer begins with humans, but strangely, it was never really about us. It was about food. Specifically, the food something else kept stealing from us. And that thief was small, hungry, and offensively talented at producing more thieves. Long before farms existed, African wildcats hunted across North Africa and Southwest Asia. They survived by detecting movements so faint that human ears would hear only silence. They usually hunted alone because catching rodents rarely requires teamwork or a lengthy meeting. Humans crossed the same landscapes, gathering plants and pursuing larger animals. The two predators occasionally noticed each other, then wisely continued in opposite directions. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, some human communities began living differently. They planted crops such as wheat and barley, built homes and planned for difficult seasons. Instead of eating the entire harvest, they stored grain for droughts and failed crops. It was one of humanity's most useful ideas and, to mice, one of our kindest. Humans saw months of survival stacked inside baskets, bins, and plastered rooms. Losing that grain could mean hunger long after the thieves themselves had disappeared. Mice saw warm buildings filled with food and guarded by enormous creatures that needed sleep. They nested beneath floors, ate while people slept, and multiplied with impressive enthusiasm. A few mice became dozens, and dozens could quietly devour a frightening amount of grain. People sealed cracks and raised containers, but the scratching always seemed to return. Then another pair of ears heard the feast taking place behind the walls. At the settlement's edge, a female wildcat paused beyond the reach of the firelight. She smelled humans, smoke, and several excellent reasons to stay far away. But beneath those unfamiliar smells, she heard the unmistakable movement of rodents. She had not come looking for friendship, shelter, or a basket beside the fire. She came because the human settlement sounded remarkably like dinner. When the fires weakened, she slipped between buildings that seemed enormous and dangerously unfamiliar. Yet beneath the storeroom floor, an easy meal continued scratching with terrible timing. The wildcat lowered herself, waited, and struck before the mouse understood its mistake. One pounce produced more food than hours of searching through open country. The following night, the mice were still there, apparently unaware that management had changed. So the wildcat returned because reliable dinner is difficult for any hunter to ignore. Each visit taught her which noises meant danger, and which merely meant humans being loud. Meanwhile, the villagers noticed fewer mice racing between their grain containers after dark. The visitor protected their food without demanding wages, instructions, or polite conversation. Chasing her away would have solved nothing, and probably delighted the mice. So the people allowed her to remain, provided she kept a sensible distance. She allowed them to remain too, which was probably the greater act of tolerance. Perhaps someone left scraps while curious children watched from the doorway. We cannot know the first moment because nobody recorded the night a wildcat stayed. It was probably thousands of small decisions repeated around many settlements. Other wildcats found similar hunting grounds wherever stored grain attracted rodents. But cats calm enough to tolerate people could hunt where larger predators avoided going. They gained prey, shelter, and safer places in which to raise kittens. To their mother, humans remained a danger that had slowly become predictable. To the kittens, humans were simply another noisy feature of the world. This was natural selection taking place beside cooking fires instead of deep wilderness. Some fled, while others stayed to accept scraps or investigate an outstretched hand. Generation after generation, fear softened without erasing the skilled predator underneath. Nobody announced that a wild species had officially become domesticated. There was no ceremony, agreement, or tiny paw print placed beneath a contract. The distance between both species simply became smaller, then smaller again. This is why cats are often said to have wandered in and domesticated themselves. Cats would probably prefer that version because it gives humans almost none of the credit. Cats approached because settlements offered prey, while humans tolerated cats because rodents threatened food. Later, people fed certain cats, protected kittens, and carried useful hunters into new places. That may explain why cats seek affection, then suddenly behave as though they have never met you. Domesticating a population required human-friendly behavior to continue across many generations. Cats made the process difficult to trace because their skeletons barely changed. Their old bones rarely reveal whether an animal feared people or slept beside them. One dramatic clue appeared on Cyprus, an island without native wildcats. Around 9,500 years ago, a cat was deliberately buried remarkably close to a human. It had crossed open water, almost certainly transported aboard a human boat. It did not swim there, paddle there, or purchase passage with a basket of grain. The grave cannot reveal whether it was a companion, hunter, or carefully tamed wildcat, but it proves that something unusual had already developed between cats and people. Newer ancient DNA has made the answer less tidy and more interesting. Many supposed early domestic cats in Europe were actually native European wildcats. Europe's house cats now appear to have arrived much later from North Africa. Their precise birthplace remains uncertain, but their African wildcat ancestry is clear. In Egypt, the growing relationship finally becomes much easier to see. At Hierakonpolis, people deliberately buried adult wildcats and kittens near a human cemetery. Some survived broken bones, suggesting humans restrained, protected, or cared for them. They may not have been pets, but they were no longer treated as ordinary wildlife. The space between useful hunter and valued companion was steadily becoming harder to see. Centuries later, paintings placed collared cats beneath chairs and beside Egyptian families. They caught pests and occupied the intimate spaces of domestic life. Cats became associated with Bastet, a goddess of protection, fertility, and the home. That does not mean every Egyptian considered the nearest alley cat a god. The reality was more complicated and sometimes far darker than the popular version. Cats were eventually bred, killed, and mummified in huge numbers as religious offerings. Egyptian society could admire cats, use them, protect them, and exploit them simultaneously. From North Africa, trade carried cats aboard ships moving between Mediterranean ports. Grain ships attracted rodents, turning each voyage into a floating hunting ground. Cats needed no pasture or wagon. Wherever prey survived, they could begin again. During the Roman period, domestic cats began appearing across Europe in growing numbers. Roads, military settlements, farms, and markets carried them beyond the Mediterranean coast. In ancient China, native leopard cats formed a similar partnership around farming communities. They lived near people for thousands of years, but never became true domestic cats. House cats arrived there much later through trade routes connecting distant parts of Asia. Wherever stored food traveled, rodents followed, and cats usually found employment waiting. Ships eventually carried them to the Americas, Australia, and remote islands. There, they protected supplies but also hunted wildlife that had never learned to fear them. The instincts that made cats useful near grain made them devastating in fragile ecosystems. For most of this journey, cats still resembled the wild hunters that first approached us. Only recently did breeders deliberately create many of today's distinctive shapes and coats. Even their voices reveal how cleverly they adapted to living beside us. Adult wildcats rarely meow to one another, but house cats frequently meow at humans. They learned that the correct sound could open doors, summon attention, and occasionally produce chicken. Purring, rubbing, and slow blinking deepened a partnership that began with mutual suspicion. Yet the old hunter never vanished beneath these new ways of communicating. It returns whenever a curtain moves, an insect lands, or a toy crosses the floor. So when your cat watches from a windowsill, look beyond the familiar little face. Behind those eyes waits an animal that entered our homes without surrendering the wild. We built settlements, stored grain, and accidentally invited mice to live beside us. The mice attracted wildcats, the wildcats tolerated people, and people slowly welcomed them. Thousands of years later, their descendant sleeps in your house as though it planned everything. And, to be fair, it probably did. Every ordinary house cat is the latest chapter of a wild hunter that invited itself inside.